Hi everybody, this is Farrelly. I am a professor at St. Michael's College in the Applied Linguistics Department and the MAT-SEL program. I actually grew up in South Carolina, and fun fact, I played golf from the age of 7 and was on the boys' high school team. And through my golf culture, I learned the expression, take a mulligan, which means to do it over if you've got a really bad shot. So I am going to take a mulligan on this presentation. This was originally part of a webinar offered through TESOL, put together by the Teacher Education Interest section. I was invited by Heidi Faust and Kristen Lindahl. And in full transparency, as soon as Kristen introduced me yesterday, I had an unexpected, first time ever, panic attack of some sort and fought for the first 7 or 8 minutes to get my breath and try to process what was happening. So I'm going to do this again because this is my passion. It's very important to me, and I want to share this information in a way that's effective. And I want to share with a little more time some of the resources that I think will be helpful to teachers of adult emergent readers, adults with refugee background status. So here we go, taking my mulligan. So this was, as I said, part of a webinar on integrating social justice in teacher education. And for me, this is an issue of social justice because teachers of adult emergent readers and adults with refugee background really need to be prepared to work with this population because they do have many challenges they're facing whenever they are resettled into a country of resettlement, be that the US, UK, Australia, Sweden, Norway, etc. There's a lot we need to know, and as teacher educators, a lot we need to do to prepare our teachers. So I'm going to go over some of that responsibility. I'll talk about a few challenges that we face when trying to implement this element of teacher education into a TESOL program and opportunities we have to make an impact. And then I'll give you a slight overview of a course I designed called Teaching Adult Emergent Readers. So first of all, in 2004, 2005, there were a couple of publications that came out by Martha Bigelow and Elaine Terone from the University of Minnesota. And they were critically evaluating the knowledge base in second language acquisition theory and noting that a lot of the theories that we've been basing our TESOL teacher education on for decades have come about through research that was done with participants who are educated, who are literate, who are typically studying in academic settings. And when we think about our adult refugee background students and our young refugee background students, we know that that population wasn't part of the majority of this research. So they put out a call to all of us to come together and fill some of this gap. So in responding to this call, several researchers have come forward in these years, and these are just a few of the studies that have been compiled over the years since 2005, 2006. There is an organization that's a really great resource to go to for more research, for more studies on teaching and learning by adult emergent readers. And it is LESLA. It is near and dear to my heart. It's an organization that started as a small group of international researchers who came together and really wanted to put their heads together to sort of figure out how can we better serve this population. So LESLA stands for Literacy Education and Second Language Learning for Adults. In its original version, it was actually Low Educated Second Language Learning by Adults. So if you see that version of the acronym, it's the same organization. We've just gone through a little bit of a facelift to be a little bit more asset-oriented. So LESLA has a symposia every year, and they go back and forth from English-speaking to non-English-speaking countries. So it's either in Canada, US, or England one year, for example, and then the following year it'll be elsewhere, usually in Europe. I will show you right now the website for LESLA. Currently, this is our website, and there's a list here of all the former symposia. And when you go to some of these links, you'll find descriptions of the symposia, links to the proceedings, which is where you can find a lot of the research that's been coming out of this annual meeting and this community of practitioners. Some of them don't have as much information. They may have programs from the conference, or at least they have a contact person who you can email to ask about how you can get the proceedings. Something useful on this site is the links. If you go here to the links, you'll find a lot of different links you can follow through on. You've got teacher resources. This is probably the most useful for us as teacher educators and educators. ESL Literacy Network has really wonderful e-readers with authentic photographs and stories that are useful, directly useful to our students' lives. That's out of Canada. Multilingual Minnesota and Minnesota Literacy Council have some really great videos and teaching tools. ELLU, which is on the Links website, I'll show that shortly, has some online courses that you can take for free, and they do have one module in particular entitled Teaching Adult Emergent Readers. There are some databases listed here by country, or sorry, not by country. These ones are just databases that store a lot of information related to adult literacy. I will say that this site is being transferred over to a new site. There are several broken links and dead ends on this site, unfortunately. But as of end of May, early June, we're launching our new site. So this is what the new site will look like. Still has all of the same information in place with links repaired and updated information where necessary. So for example, if you go to Teacher Resources, you will find a link to useful websites. And at the top, we're profiling the ones that are sort of the most awesome, I'll say. And then down below, by country, a whole lot of other websites that are useful by teachers, by researchers. If we go back to resources, teacher resources, there's professional development opportunities you can explore. Up here under annual meetings, I have moved over information about all of the annual meetings in the past and where you can get information about them. One thing I want to bring to your attention for those who watch this soon is that we're meeting in Palermo, Italy this coming October, and the call for proposals is due on April 30th. So you still have time at this point to get in a call, or a proposal rather, and join us in Palermo. Who doesn't want to go to Sicily? When you follow this link, it'll take you to the page built by our hosts in Palermo with a lot of information about the city and how to put in your proposal, registration, accommodations, etc. Okay, let's pop back out to the slideshow. So in addition to LESLA, Refugee Concerns Interest section within TESOL is also a good way to find out more about educating adult emergent readers who, from this point forward, I'm going to refer to them as LESLA learners because it's become a common reference term in the field. It's a lot easier to say. Refugee Concerns puts together panels at TESOL at the convention. This past year in Chicago, we had a panel on trauma, a panel on advocacy, and a panel on using students' personal narratives to build language. And there was also a panel on action research. And those were co-organized with other interest sections. This coming year, we're going to be partnering with the Applied Linguistics interest section, the Teacher Education interest section, and Second Language Writing interest section. And our academic session at TESOL in Atlanta will be on SIFE, students with interrupted formal education, and transitions from high school into college or career. So when we think about teaching LESLA learners, we have to reconsider the knowledge base, and this is where teacher educators play a huge role. This is a list of 10 sort of key components to the knowledge base of LESLA teachers that was put together by Patsy Vinogradov, now Egan, and Astrid Leiden in 2009. And some of this is left out of most TESOL curricula, namely the three that I've put in red here. The refugee experience gets very little attention in a TESOL curriculum, and in the next slide I'll go over some of the aspects of that that I think are particularly important to integrate into TESOL teacher preparation programs. Emergent readers, particularly adult emergent readers, is something that we don't learn a lot about in a TESOL program. Folks who are on a K6, K12 licensure or endorsement track in the US will get a lot of preparation to teach literacy, and they can draw on that to teach adults, but there's still a lot that goes into it to make it meaningful and relevant to adults, because we can't teach A is for apple, B is for boy or ball to adults and get very far. Patsy then updated the model a little bit to simplify it, tucking all of these elements and more into the 4 main components, which include adult learning theory, classroom practice or teaching, immigrant and refugee experience, language and language acquisition, and all of that sort of undergirded by early literacy instruction. So within the module on refugee and immigrant experience, there is really so much to learn. The Cultural Orientation Resource Center, which can be found online at culturalorientation.net, has really excellent refugee backgrounders that you can access on all the different populations that are coming into respective host countries. And they're not all uniform, but there are a handful of them that contain these three core pieces. Country profile, which is basically outlining the education, geography, politics, climate, family structures, religion of the home countries, the original countries of these populations. Then there's some discussion on the conditions in first asylum countries. So you'll know sort of maybe how long they were in a refugee camp, what the camps were like, was there health care, did they set up a livelihood with farms, did they have education, and then considering all of that, what are the implications for resettlement and integration into their new society? Some camps, for example, may have had pre-departure orientations to get them sort of familiar with the countries they were going to be landing in, whereas others simply don't offer that. Some have schools, others don't. We have to know a lot about the educational backgrounds of our students, and it's not uniform across even a given population, so you can't say, for example, that all Somalis or all Bhutanese come with this background or come with this level of L1 literacy, but there are some generalizations based on home countries and also first asylum countries. It's really important that we recognize the valuable assets that they all bring into the classroom. As an example, linguistic capital is something that many of our students have quite a good bit of. Most of them are multilingual. Your average Congolese refugee will come probably with Swahili, French, Lingala, maybe Kirundi if they pass through Burundi, maybe Kinyarwanda if they pass through Rwanda. Deficit narratives are something that are going to be faced by all of the newcomers around the world right now because of the rhetoric around refugees, around undocumented immigrants. So it's important that in our TESOL programs, we prepare our teachers with an awareness of these deficit narratives and how to counter them in both the country, in the community, with our neighbors, with our coworkers, with our families, and then within educational institutions themselves, moving from the perspective that if they can't read, how can I teach them? If they can't speak English, how can I teach them? Why are they here? Why don't they speak English? Why don't they get a job? All of these things are just focusing on the negative and the lacks, and there's so much more that we can be focusing on. But once our student teachers, once we know these deficit narratives, we can act as advocates and allies to counter them. Another big topic that's come up a lot lately is trauma. At TESOL, one of our presenters on the panel related to trauma, her name is Raichle Johnson, she spoke to the fact that 100% of refugees have experienced trauma. At least one trauma event, maybe more, but by the nature of them being refugees, they have experienced trauma. So it's not a question of if, but to what extent, and to what extent does it impact learning. So we have to integrate into our TESOL prep programs discussion of trauma and learning, trauma-informed pedagogy, how to create trauma-informed schools and communities, and then also how to work with trauma stories, not inviting them, but rather responding to them whenever they come up in our classes. And of course, honoring the resilience of our learners and recognizing that everyone deals with trauma differently and the impact of trauma lasts for different durations depending on the person and depending on the severity. So one core thing here, a big takeaway is as TESOL educators, we are not healthcare professionals necessarily, so we need to identify pathways to care, which requires really knowing who's out in our community that we can network with to make sure that from the classroom to the school to the greater network, we've got places to go whenever we need to support our students. So the sociocultural turn in L2 teacher education has been really impactful on me and on my work, and I think on probably many of you as well. One thing about this approach is that there's been a big call to integrate more field experiences throughout the TESOL program of study rather than leaving practicum to the very end. We want to see students having early teaching experiences and ongoing classroom experiences so that they constantly have this opportunity to make sense of what they're doing and what they're learning within different cultural, social, and historical contexts. Every classroom is different, every age group, every student background, and so really spreading out these field experiences will just enrich the overall teacher development process. Involving learners in reflection and reflective practice through praxis is very important, which means that they're constantly theorizing what's happening in the classroom in relation to what they're learning in the program. And this is where having opportunities to be in the community working with adult refugee background students sheds a little different perspective on the theories they're studying in the program. Finally, I just really like Kumarava Divalu's approach, which is more taking macro and micro strategies that can be adapted and applied in different contexts, rather than looking at methods as sort of one size fits all. Here's communicative language teaching, here's task-based teaching, here's audiolingual method, now go ahead and do it. So I think his approach is really fitting the pedagogy of particularity, because it calls for kind of modeling your approach based on who you're teaching and where you're teaching. The sociocultural turn, to me, is just really intuitive, and I'm glad that it's catching on. So some challenges and opportunities we face in integrating this into our program. First of all, the challenges: how do we find space within our curriculum to adequately develop all the student-teacher knowledge that they could need to go into the various contexts? We have some students who are going into EFL, some who want to go into higher education IEPs, some want to go to K-12 settings, and then some who want to go into community-based work. And that's just a sample of possible directions they could take. So obviously it's going to be hard in any given curricula to really prepare them for all possible contexts. How do we make time to do the work required to develop our knowledge base? As we all know, when you're teaching a course to prepare teachers or to teach anything, you have to do a lot of the reading and the preparation and make sure you know what you're talking about so that you can create meaningful and engaging opportunities in class to get into the content. So we have to do a lot of homework if we don't already have a LESLA teacher knowledge base. We have to cultivate really important connections in the community, because when you work with refugee background students, there's so much more involved than just the student. There are their caseworkers, their families, their children's teachers, their healthcare providers. They come to school some days with bills and insurance information and tax information. And so as the teacher, you need to be connected in the community to find out who all these people are that are in their corner that can help them with all of these needs. And then we also have to avoid perpetuating a single story about them. We can and should focus on the fact that emerging readers have certain needs that are unique to those who have L1 literacy, but we don't want to put too much emphasis on the deficit, the fact that they lack literacy. We do want to acknowledge that there is trauma, and we want to find ways to address the trauma in class appropriately, maybe through yoga or mindfulness activities, but we don't want to highlight the fact that they have trauma. It's not the only thing about refugees. So we have to avoid perpetuating that sort of deficit perspective. I'm just going to flip those challenges into opportunities. The exciting thing is that we get to get creative with our colleagues and find ways to innovate within our curriculum. We get to hopefully be inspired to read and to dive into the new research and see what's happening and what light it sheds on our existing fat textbooks on second language acquisition theory, and what articles we can pick from and pull into our curriculum. We get the opportunity to go into the community, to get out of our colleges and universities and form relationships with stakeholders, from school teachers to nonprofit organization managers to resettlement agencies. And then if we are privileged enough to be working with adult refugee background students, then we grow so much from these interactions. So at the very minimum, I would suggest that we read, we reach out, and we do our research. We have to know the resources, so I've already pointed out LESLA with you, which is kind of a hub and an access point for all the other resources, but I think that's a good start. Minnesota Literacy Council, as I mentioned, ESL Literacy Network, and then the ELLU online courses. I want to take you back out and show you that website. So that's actually through links.ed.gov, And when you get to the main site, you're going to go to State Resources, Federal Initiatives, and then scroll down to English Language Learner University. And here you'll see a description of what ELLU was or is. And then if you click on info about more courses, you will get to the modules. And here we've got one, Teaching Adult ELLs Who Are Emergent Readers. You enroll in the class here. This one takes approximately 2.5 hours to complete. So it's not a huge time investment, but it is an important place to start for you to shore up some of that knowledge. Of course, when you go to the site, if you just type in ELLU, you'll get there a little bit faster. I just wanted to navigate you through it anyway. Okay, so that's at the minimum what we can do. Knowing the learners, of course, if we're going to come in to teach a class about the refugee background students in our community, we should probably know who they are. So who is your city resettling? Here in Vermont, for example, we've got mostly people coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, still, well, not so much this year, but had been from Somalia, Bhutanese and Nepali, some Burundi, some Iraqi, and others, little groups here and there. We had 2 Syrian families resettled a year ago. So who's in your community? It might be Karen, it might be Burundi, it might be Afghani. Figure out who they are, know as much as you can about them, and pass on that knowledge. I also recommend the documentary Rain in a Dry Land. It's about 2 Somali families who go from Kakuma refugee camp into the United States. And the documentary follows them for about a year or more to show what it looked like in their pre-departure orientation, how it was for them getting on the plane and landing in America, and what it looks like as they try to integrate into their new communities, including the experiences of their children in the school system. And then, of course, at the very least, visit some language programs and observe some classes in your community. And if you can, teach. I teach 2 different classes every week as a volunteer for the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program. And on the one hand, it makes me a much better teacher-educator because I really am intimately connected with what that space looks like and feels like. And on the other hand, it's just one of the most rewarding things I do. I love those students, and as kind of anxious as I can get walking into every class because I don't know who's going to show up, and I've always got 3 lesson plans in the back of my head, I never drive home without a huge smile on my face. They've become my friends, they're my community, and it's just very rewarding. Taking it a step further, if you can prioritize this work in your program somehow, I would suggest starting with possibly adding a module to an existing course, maybe a module within a methods course to talk about teaching them and strategies, maybe a module in the SLA course that brings in some of this research. There are lots of places to plug in, teaching adult refugee background students specifically within a TESOL program. I am a proponent of even developing an entire course if you have space, maybe as an elective or a special topic in your program. I developed teaching adult emergent readers with a colleague in Utah, and we delivered it there. And then I taught it again here in Vermont, and we opened it up to the community. So we had community-based teachers, we had K-12 teachers, we had our MA TESOL students, and we had some undergrads. And I'm now tweaking the course a little bit to broaden it to be teaching refugee background students more generally, so that we can also include topics around K-12 refugee background students. I strongly suggest and love community-engaged learning in TESOL curricula, otherwise known as service learning. One program or one opportunity we have this semester in my CBI class is developing content-based units for a local high school teacher who will implement them in the fall. And the theme of our unit is Young Change Makers. So we've chosen 3 different change makers, one from Sierra Leone, one from Pakistan, and one from the US. And we've built lessons around the texts and the stories, and we're going to donate all of that to our high school partner, and she'll teach her kiddos in the fall. And then, of course, the practicum is a wonderful way to get out into the community. In my Teaching Adult Emergent Readers class, I had a 20-hour practicum attached to the course. Most of my colleagues come to me and ask if I can take practicum students into my classes, and I've had an anthropology professor send her undergraduate students to me whenever they were studying refugees in her culture, health, and healing class. And it's really, if it's done well, in a way that's not sort of drop in, drop out, and if it's created in a way that's mutually beneficial, it's a win-win for everyone, because as the teacher in my classes, I get extra people on hand to help with the multiple levels, and then the undergrads that come in or the TESOL students that come in get to have this amazing experience with this community that they otherwise may not have had. And then we can continue to be adding to the SLA knowledge base by conducting ethical research with this population, trying to just explore what their challenges are, what their strengths are, and what the language acquisition process looks like, exploring teacher development, so many topics we can be researching, and we should be. And then, of course, the partnerships are key. We have to get out there and know who we're working with. If you're sending people into community-based classes to do practica, for example, make sure you get down there, meet those directors, meet the teachers, observe a little bit, make some connections, rather than just sort of sending the students out to do that themselves and not having that connection from you to the organizations. So now I'll briefly go over a course I designed, and I'm going to be using, as I said, Patsy's model. This is how I kind of make sure that I touch on all the pieces that should be there to develop the knowledge base for our LESLA teachers. So first of all, importantly, is the immigrant and refugee experience, knowing who we're teaching in our very community, and then what knowing that can do for our curriculum design and our material selection and for building community around food, around holidays, around anything that's specific to the groups we're working with. So the three main tasks I do to target this are using the Cultural Orientation Resource Center Refugee-backgrounders. My students have to become, each of them, an expert on a group that's represented in Vermont. So they synthesize it, they put it together into a presentation, they talk about it, and then we have a discussion, and they do a practicum in my class too, so they have to do 20 hours, either one-on-one tutoring or small group teaching, and by the time we're doing these cultural orientation packets, they've already sort of identified who they're going to work with, so that really gives them a nice sense of what's going on for that person based on this information. We do watch Rain in a Dry Land, and we reflect on that. And then they write the profile of a LESLA learner, and that is basically taking the person they're tutoring or choosing one person from the class, and over time sort of developing a biography or a narrative, and also looking at the learning process, how that person, quote unquote, does school, and also how they interact with the materials that the student teachers bring in over the course of the semester. To build the knowledge base around teaching, a TESOL program does this. This is basically what we do. But in this particular course, the emphasis is on creating enjoyable, respectful atmosphere in the class and really cultivating a sense of relationship with the students. The roles of students and teachers in a community-based class, especially with adult refugee background students, just looks different. You can be their mentor, their advisor, you might take the kids out for some activities on the weekend, you could be a liaison with the teachers of their children, you might be in touch with their caseworker. There's just so much more to it than showing up with a lesson plan, teaching and leaving, and maybe doing some academic advising. It really goes deeper. And then, of course, simple, clear instructions, differentiating learning, because teaching adult emergent readers and adult refugee background students inherently means multiple level classes. It's really hard to get a class where everyone's at the same place. Monitoring and tracking is something that is it's a little tricky. You kind of have to come up with your own system. There are tests like Best Test and CASAs, but some programs don't have the money for those, so they leave it up to the volunteers to do their own tracking. So we talk about how to do that mindfully. And then when I talk about professionalism, it's not as so much showing up prepared and organized and well-dressed, but really showing up with your A game and with a lot of knowledge for how to work with these learners, how to think on the fly, how to be flexible, how to scaffold in the moment or differentiate in the moment when you have someone show up for the first time ever and you find out they're at a level much higher or much lower than the rest of your class. Tasks and assignments to target the teaching include observations, micro-teaching, peer observations, discussion about the teaching in class, and then providing feedback on lesson plans and materials. To target adult learning theory, this aspect of the knowledge base, basically we just make sure that when we're working with literacy instruction, we're not using materials for K2 children because these are adults. So we talk about authentic tasks and materials, keeping literacy instruction in context, and then building confidence among our learners, really tapping into their strengths and their experience, establishing routines, providing choices. A lot of this comes from some publications by Patsy Vinogradov. You've probably heard or should Google the article Maestra, The Letters Speak. It's a really great article that talks about balanced instruction for literacy and making it relevant to adults. To target language and language acquisition, we look at SLA through the lens of teaching LESLA learners. So that means bringing in some newer articles that sort of take a different look at language acquisition and literacy development from that perspective. And so we just kind of touch on these as they come up, but don't spend too much time on this stuff because that's usually covered more in the SLA class. For early literacy instruction, as I said before, unless you're a K-12 licensure or endorsement student, your TESOL classes probably don't bring in a lot of this. And so folks who get an MA TESOL or a BA TESOL may or may not be prepared to do any reading instruction when they get to the classroom. But we do focus on what are the 5 components of reading, how do you develop oral language first, and then attach it to the print. And of course, we talk about the balanced literacy approach using a whole parts whole approach. Some of the assignments that I have them do to sort of tap into their literacy instruction is taking these strategies we learn in class for developing phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, fluency, etc. Take it to their class or their tutoring situation, try it out, come back, and then we debrief. Language experience approach is something that is really wonderful to do with this population, and so the students have to develop an LEA and try it out and come back and talk about it. Some of the ones that we've done in the past, these pictures depict one where we made a fruit salad together, so we talked about all the fruit vocabulary, then different jobs such as cutting, slicing, mixing, washing, preparing, and then after we do the event, we work together to elicit the text about what happened. And I just recently took my students to the fire station, and last night they went to the police station, and this summer we are buying 2 garden plots in their town, in their community, so we're going to be growing food together this summer. And those are all just different ways that you can create experiences together as a class and then build the literacy and language work around it. Another assignment my TESOL students have is to watch Building Literacy with Adult Emergent Readers, which is a great video of Andrea Eckelberger doing an LEA lesson with her students after a trip to the hardware store. So they watch the video and they analyze it for LESLA strategies and pull out all the different ways that the instructor targeted learning specific to LESLA learners. And then throughout their practicum experience, there are reflections that they write, just kind of noting what's going on in their practicum experience. And, again, this all comes back around to social justice because of these deficit narratives and the positioning of refugee background individuals as either victims of grand atrocities or villains in the case of our Muslims since 9/11. You hear rhetoric, as my colleague Shauna Shapiro pointed out, around the refugee crisis. And she notes, whose crisis is it? It's a tragedy for these individuals who are displaced, but we talk about the crisis as if it's our crisis, it's our problem. So I just think that preparing our teachers to be the best advocates and allies they can be, both through their words and actions to counter these deficit narratives, but also through really intentional, mindful, and well-informed practice in the classroom is critical. And as TESOL teacher educators, this is our big responsibility. I have several references here and here. And please, any emails, any questions you have, just send them my way. Look forward to seeing more of you involved in LESLA. If you use Facebook, you can go to facebook.com/lesla.org and you'll find us on Facebook. And yeah, maybe we'll even see some of you in Palermo. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to take my mulligan, and I hope you found this useful. Thanks.